county surveyor wrote the value of the homestead as $2. Not low, $2. 40 acres of frozen bench land above a river nobody trusted, a stand of dead cedar, and a half-fallen soddy that leaked when it rained and leaked worse when it snowed, all of it written off as scrub a man would be foolish to want. It was the only claim in the whole Upper Valley that no other settler had troubled to file on. So at 31, with $11 sewn into the lining of his coat and a wife 3 months in the ground, Elias Renner drove a borrowed ox and a broken wagon up the last grade into the high country to live on the one piece of earth the world had decided was worthless. He meant only to survive one winter. Instead, on his first frozen night, he stood in the snow and gazed up at the sky and started to count the height of things, never knowing that the strange tall shape he would raise on that bench over 2 long years would one day be the only warm room left standing in a valley of the dead. And when the great blizzard swept down out of the north and buried every cabin to its chimney, what the men who had mocked him found waiting above the snow would make an entire county remember a man they had spent years calling a fool. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and let us know where you are watching from, because the story of the grain barn on the stilts is one you will want to see all the way to the end. Elias had not always been a man the valley laughed at. Once, back east, he had been a builder of grain elevators along the rail lines, a quiet man good with timber and levels and the patient arithmetic of weight. But the fever had taken his young wife in a single week, and the grief had taken everything else, and when a land agent said there was open ground in the far mountains where a man could start over and ask nothing of anybody, Elias had signed his name and sold his tools and gone. He did not tell anyone about the elevators. He did not tell anyone much of anything. Grief had made him silent, and silence in a small valley is easily mistaken for pride. The Upper Valley was a scatter of cabins along the creek, maybe 24 families who had come for the free soil and stayed for lack of anywhere better. They were good people, mostly, but poor and tired and quick to close ranks against a stranger. When Elias arrived that first autumn and set his lonely camp on the worthless bench above them, they watched him as people watch weather. He kept to himself. He paid for his flour in silence. He did not come to the meeting house. The wound of it went deeper than the valley knew. On the night his wife had died, Elias had promised her one thing, holding her cold hand in a rented room 1,000 miles from here. He had promised he would build something that would last, something that would keep the next person safe when he could not. It had sounded like the raving of a grieving man. But Elias was a builder, and a builder keeps his promises in wood. He had come to the mountains carrying that promise as another man might carry a photograph, and he meant to spend the rest of his life making good on it, even if no living soul ever thanked him for it. What Elias would raise on that bench across those first years would not save only his own life. But the valley could not have known that yet, and neither, in truth, did he. The first snow came early that year, and it came hard. Elias spent that first winter in the half-fallen soddy, rationing crackers and frozen beans, listening to the wind come down off the peaks like something with a grudge. He watched the creek freeze and the drifts climb the walls of the soddy until the little dwelling was more a burrow than a house. He watched, and being a man who measured things, he began to notice what the valley had stopped noticing because they had lived with it too long. He saw that the snow did not fall so much as it gathered, that it piled against every flat wall and every low roof until the cabins below him were half swallowed by their own shelter. He watched the men lower down spend the worst weeks of every winter doing nothing but shoveling, digging their doors clear each dawn only to have them buried again by dusk. And the snow, once it settled, held the cold against the ground like a wet blanket pressing a chill against the skin. And Elias, standing in the blue dark of that first brutal winter, did a thing no one else in the valley had thought to do. He looked up. He studied the height the drifts reached against his soddy, and he looked higher, at the clean cold air above where the snow could not climb, and something in the builder's mind that grief had not managed to kill began, quietly, to work. By spring he had made up his mind. He would not build low, hunched against the ground for warmth as every other soul in that valley built low. He would build high. He would raise his grain and his shelter up into the clear air on legs of timber, as he had once raised elevators above the floodline of a river, so the snow would have nothing flat to gather against, and would slide off and blow past and leave the dwelling standing free above the white. It was the plainest idea in the world. Once a man had thought of it, but no one in that valley had thought of it. And when Elias began to fell the tall, straight cedars on the north edge of his claim and strip them and sink them deep, the valley climbed up to watch, and the valley laughed. They laughed as tired men laugh at what they do not understand. There was a big landholder lower in the valley named Amos Croft, a broad, loud man who owned the best bottom ground and half the valley's debts besides, and it was Croft who laughed loudest. He stood below the bench with his thumbs in his belt and looked up at the 4 great cedar posts Elias had sunk into the frozen ground, each one taller than 2 men, and set deep in stone and packed earth, and he shook his head like a man watching a fool count his own fingers. "You planning to keep your hogs up a tree, Renner?" Croft called, and the men around him laughed. "Or is it you that means to roost up there like a hen?" Elias did not answer. He set his level against the post and read it and made a small mark and went on working. That was the worst of it, the valley decided. The man would not even defend himself. He would not explain. He simply sank his posts and raised his sills and let them laugh. And a man who will not explain himself is a man a valley will happily fill in the blanks for. So they filled them in. They said Elias Renner had lost his wits along with his wife. They said the high country had turned his brain. Children were told the Stilt house was where the mad builder lived, and they dared each other to climb the grade and touch the posts and run. When Elias came down for flour, the storekeeper weighed it slow and said little, and the men on the porch went quiet until he had gone, and then the laughter started up again behind him like water closing over a stone. The building went up through 2 summers and the winter between. Elias raised 4 tall timber legs and braced them with cross timbers cut on the slant so they shed weight to the ground. Atop them he framed a floor a full 10 feet over the earth, and on that floor he built a stout square room of tight-fitted cedar plank, chinked with moss and river clay and lined inside with a second wall so that between the 2 walls lay a hand's width of trapped dead air. He built 1 steep stair to the door, a stair he could pull up behind him like a drawbridge if he had a mind to. He set the small windows high and shuttered them thick. And under the peak of the roof, in the gable that faced down the valley, he cut a single small opening and fitted it with a shutter of its own, and no one below could think what that little window high in the gable was for. The grain went in the lower half of the raised room, sealed in bins off the cold floor. Elias lived in the upper half, a single warm room with an iron stove whose pipe he ran up through the roof, and a narrow bed, and a shelf of his dead wife's few books, and the tools he would not sell. From the 1 small opening in the gable a man could see the whole valley spread out below, every cabin, every thread of chimney smoke, all of it hunched low against the ground, while Elias Renner sat warm and dry, 10 feet aloft in the clear cold air. When the second winter came, The valley saw the first strange thing, though they did not yet understand it. Below, the snow gathered against the cabins as it always had, and the men dug and dug. But up on the bench, the snow slid off Elias Renner's slanted roof and blew past his high walls and heaped in long, clean drifts on the open ground beyond, and the space beneath the raised floor stayed swept nearly bare by the wind that funneled under it. The Stilt house stood free of the snow as a boat stands free of the water. Croft rode up once in that second winter on some pretense of a strayed cow, and he sat his horse below the bench and looked up a long time at the clean, dry dwelling floating above the white. And he did not laugh that day, but he did not tip his hat either. He turned his horse and rode back down, and what he thought he kept to himself. That should have been the end of the mockery. It was not. Men do not easily give up a joke they have grown comfortable with, and a valley that has decided a man is a fool will hold to that verdict long past the point of sense. Through the third summer they still called it the roost. They still called him the mad builder. And Elias, who had by then finished the thing he set out to build and had begun quietly to build a second, said nothing to any of them and kept his own counsel and watched the sky. Because Elias had noticed one more thing that no one else in the valley had troubled to notice. He had been keeping a record, in a small hand, in a book he kept on the shelf beside his wife's Bible. He wrote down the snows, he wrote down how deep and how early, how the wind sat, how the creek ran, how the birds behaved, and how early the deer descended from the high passes. And in the third autumn, reading back over his own 3 winters of small, careful notes, Elias Renner set down his pen and sat very still, because the pattern the numbers made had begun to frighten him. Stay with me here, because what Elias saw in that little book is the moment the whole story turns, and it is the reason a man who never asked the valley for a thing was about to go down that grade and try one last time to make them listen. Subscribe now if you have not, because the winter Elias saw coming was not an ordinary winter, and the valley had exactly one chance to survive it, and they were about to laugh that chance away. The numbers said the same thing 3 ways. The high snows had come earlier each of the 3 winters he had kept his book, and the creek had run lower each autumn, which meant the ground was already dry and would freeze deep and hard before the first heavy fall ever came to cover it. The deer had descended from the passes a full 2 weeks earlier this year than last, thin and jumpy, moving with a jitter Elias had learned to read as fear of what was behind them up high. And the wind had swung around to sit steady out of the north, the killing quarter, weeks before it had any business doing so. Elias was not a superstitious man. He was a man who measured things, and everything he could measure pointed one way. A great deep snow was coming early, ahead of any thaw onto ground already frozen iron hard, and it would arrive with a north wind behind it. It would not be a winter. It would be a burial. He knew what a snow like that would do to the valley below. He had watched 3 winters of ordinary snow half swallow those low cabins already. A killing storm on frozen ground would pack the drifts to the eaves in a night and to the ridgepoles in a day. And the men would dig, and the snow would fill the digging faster than they could throw it, and the weight of it would press the cold down through every low roof, and the families beneath would smother slow in their own buried houses while they still believed they were only snowed in. Elias had seen it happen once, years before, to a rail camp caught the same way. He had helped dig the camp out in the spring. He did not want to dig this valley out in the spring. So Elias Renner did the hardest thing he had done since he buried his wife. He came down off his bench and went among the people who had laughed at him for 3 years, and he tried to make them listen. He went first to the storekeeper, and he laid his little book open on the counter and showed the man the columns of snows and the dates the deer had come down. And he said plainly, "There is a burying snow coming early, and it is coming soon. Your roof sits too low and too flat. Get your family off the low ground before it falls, or build your beam higher, or your house will fill and hold the cold on you." The storekeeper looked at the book and looked at the strange tall man who never spoke and had now come down to tell him his house would kill him, and he laughed, uneasy, and said the snow always looked like the end of the world and never was. Elias went to the meeting house on a Sunday, hat in his hands, and stood up in front of the whole valley, and it was the most words any of them had ever heard him string together. He told them what the numbers said. He told them the wind was wrong and the deer were early and the ground was dry and would freeze deep, and he told them, in the plain flat voice of a man reading a level, that a great many of them would die in their own homes before spring if they did not build higher or move to higher ground now, while there was still time to swing an axe. For a moment the meeting house was quiet, and then, from the back, Amos Croft began to laugh. "He wants us all to roost in trees," Croft called out, standing, playing to the room. "The mad builder has been up on his stilts too long. Now he means to scare us up onto our own. Sit down, Renner. God has sent snow to this valley every year of our lives and every year of our fathers' lives, and every year we have dug out and lived, and we do not need a lunatic who talks to a notebook to teach us how to weather a winter." The room laughed with him. They laughed because Croft was rich and Elias was strange, and because it is easier to laugh with the loud man you know than to believe the quiet man you have already decided is a fool. A few of them, a very few, looked at the book in Elias's hands and did not laugh, but no one stood up. No one crossed the room to his side. And Elias, seeing it, closed his little book and put on his hat and walked out of the meeting house and back up the grade to the one warm room in the valley that would not fill with snow. He did not go back down again, but he did not stop either, because Elias Renner had made a promise to a dying woman that he would build something to keep the next person safe, and a valley's laughter did not release him from a promise like that. That was why he had built the second thing. That was why he had cut the small opening in the gable that no one could puzzle out, and that was why, all through the third summer, while the valley called him mad, he had been hauling up onto his bench far more grain and firewood and salted meat than one lone man could ever eat in one winter, stacking it in the lower half of his raised room until the bins groaned. He had built high enough for many. He had laid in food enough for many. He had cut a window to see the valley by, and he had a lantern and he had a plan he had told no one, because the last time he had told them anything they had laughed him out of the meeting house. He was not building to save himself. He had worked that out on the night his wife died. He was building to be there when they finally stopped laughing. And so, through the last golden weeks of that autumn, Elias Renner kept his lantern trimmed and his window shutter oiled and his great stair ready to lower. And he watched the north, and he waited for the snow he knew was coming. It came on a Tuesday, in the last week of what should have been autumn. Below, the men were still bringing in the last of the wood when the sky went the color of an old bruise and the temperature fell so fast that the creek stopped its talking within an hour and lay silent under a skin of gray ice. The first flakes were small and dry and hard, and they did not drift down soft like honest snow. They came sideways, driven flat on the north wind, hissing against the low cabin walls like sand. By dark the wind was screaming down off the peaks, and the snow was coming so thick that a man could not see his own hand held out at arm's length, and it was piling, not falling, packing itself against every flat wall and every low roof exactly as Elias Renner had said it would. The valley dug. Of course they dug. They dug their doorways clear, and the snow filled them again in minutes. They dug, and the wind mocked them, as they had once mocked Elias, filling every shovel stroke faster than a man could throw it, and by the middle of the first night the cabins were buried to their windows, and by the second dawn the smart ones understood, far too late, that this was the snow the mad builder had drawn in his little book. And up on the bench, floating clean and dark above the churning white, one small opening in a gable came alight with the steady gold of a trimmed lantern, and stayed lit, and did not go out. Elias had lit it the first hour of the storm, and he kept it lit through the night, and he sat below it in his warm, dry room with the stove exhaling its low red breath, and he watched the valley disappear. He could do nothing else yet. No man could cross that ground in that wind and live. So he kept the lantern in the window like a thing set out to say a single word over and over into the dark, and the word the lantern said was here. Here is warmth. Here is a floor above the snow. Here is a door that will open. He did not know if anyone below could see it through the driving white. He only knew he had promised to be here, and so he was here, and the light stayed lit. On the third day, the wind broke. It did not stop so much as exhaust itself, sinking to a hard, cold stillness under a low white sky, and in that stillness the valley lay changed beyond knowing. Where 24 cabins had stood there were now only long, smooth swells in the snow, humps and hollows with here and there a black stub of chimney poking through, some of them smoking thin and some of them, terribly, not smoking at all. The whole low valley had become one white field with the dead and the dying buried under it, and above it all, on the bench, dark and square and impossibly dry, stood the mad builder's roost with its lantern still burning gold in the little gable window. The first to reach it was a boy. His name was Tomas, and he was 9, and his family's cabin had held longest because his father had built it on the highest of the low ground. But by the third night the snow had pressed the roof beam down until it cracked, and his father had punched a hole up through the drift and put the boy out through it and told him to make for the light. The boy had seen the light. Half the valley, in the worst hours, had glimpsed that steady gold window floating above the storm, and had not understood it, or had been too proud or too buried to answer it. But the boy, floundering chest deep and half frozen across the buried valley, had fixed on the light as a drowning man fixes on a lamp, and he had crawled and swum and clawed himself up that long slope to the base of the bench, and there, too weak to climb, he had fallen against one of the great cedar posts and begun to cry. Elias heard him. Elias had been listening for exactly this for 3 days. He lowered the great stair and went down it into the cold and gathered the boy up like a sack of grain and carried him up into the warm room and wrapped him in his own blankets and put warm broth into him a spoonful at a time until the boy stopped shaking. And then Elias asked him, quietly, who else is alive down there, and where? The boy told him what he could. There's Ma and the little ones at the Harlows, he whispered, and the Vances, and I heard old Pruitt hollering under his own roof. Elias nodded and wrote no word of it in any book. He only fixed each name in his head. You stay by the stove, he told the boy. You keep the broth warm for whoever I bring next. Can you do that? The boy nodded, and Elias Renner took a coil of rope and a shovel and a lantern of his own, and he went down off his bench into the buried valley to bring up the living. What he did across the following 2 days he never spoke of afterward, so it comes down to us only through the ones he pulled out of the snow. They said he found the smoking chimneys first, and dug down along them to the roofs, and broke through, and hauled the families up from their own buried houses one by one, the children first, then the women, then the men, roping them together and breaking a trail up toward the warm room on the stilts. They said he waded to the cabins that had stopped smoking and dug into those too, and out of some of them he brought the living, half gone with cold, and out of some of them he brought nothing, and those he covered again and marked with a stake, and said not one word. They said the strange, silent man who had never explained himself to anyone worked without rest and without speech, his face gray with cold and grief, until the last living soul in that valley had been carried up out of the white and set down safe on a floor 10 feet over the snow that had tried to bury them. They filled the raised room, all of them, 40-odd survivors of a valley that had laughed at the man now feeding them. The grain he had laid in beyond all sense fed them. The firewood he had stacked beyond all reason warmed them. The double wall he had built, with its hand's width of trapped dead air, held the killing cold outside, while 40 frightened people breathed and wept and slowly, over days, came back to life in a single warm room floating above a graveyard of snow. And through all of it, Elias Renner said almost nothing, only tended his stove and portioned his food, and stepped over sleeping children to trim the lantern that still burned high in the gable. Because there might, he said, when anyone asked, still be someone out there yet who had not found the light. The last man up the stair was Amos Croft. Stay with me, because this is the moment the whole story has been walking toward, and it is not the moment you think. Croft's fine bottomland house had been the lowest and the flattest and the proudest in the valley, and it had filled the fastest. He had dug longest and believed hardest that he did not need any mad builder's help, and it had very nearly killed him and his whole family, and in the end it was Elias who dug them out. Elias who roped the loud man's frozen children up the grade. Elias who half carried Amos Croft himself up the great stair into the warmth. And when Croft could speak again, sitting on the floor of the roost with his own saved children asleep against him and the mad builder's borrowed blanket around his shoulders, he looked up at the tall, quiet man who had never once answered his laughter. And the whole warm, crowded room went silent to hear what the loudest man in the valley would say. "Why?" Croft said. His voice had lost all its bigness. "We laughed at you. 3 years we laughed. I stood below your posts and called you a fool in front of every man here. Why did you build it big enough for all of us? Why did you lay in food for a valley that never gave you a kind word? You could have sat up here warm and let us drown in our own roofs, and no man could have blamed you." Why? For a long moment Elias did not answer, and the room thought perhaps he would not, as he had never answered anything. But then the strange, silent man went to the shelf and took down the small book he kept beside his dead wife's Bible, and he did not open it to the columns of snows. He opened it to the very first page, where, before ever he had come to this valley, he had written a single line in a shaking hand in a rented room 1,000 miles east. And Elias Renner read it out loud, and it was the most any of them had ever heard him say, and the only time any of them ever saw him weep. "Build something that will last," he read, "and keep the next one safe when I cannot." He closed the book. My wife asked me for that when she was dying. She was the only person who ever thought I was worth listening to, and she made me promise it with the last strength she had, and then she died, and I had nothing left in the world but the promise. I did not build this to save myself. A man does not need 4 tall posts and food for 40 to save one lonely man. He looked around the warm room at the sleeping children and the weeping women and the men who had jeered at him for years. "I built it for you. All of you. From the first post I sank, I built it for whoever in this valley would need it on the night it finally came. I built it high so the snow could not take you. I laid in the grain so it could feed you. And I cut that little window there and hung a lantern in it so that on the worst night of your lives, when your own houses turned against you, there would be one light left burning above the snow. That meant somebody had thought of you before you ever knew you needed thinking of. Croft shook his head slowly, and his ruined voice cracked as he spoke. I fought you the whole way down that stair, he said. Half froze and out of my head, I called you the mad builder even as you were carrying my boy. And you never said a word back. There was nothing to say back, Elias answered. A man does not argue with a drowning man. He pulls him out. He set the book back on the shelf beside his wife's Bible. You called it the roost, Elias said. You called me the mad builder. But I never built a roost for one man. I built a lifeboat for a valley, and I kept the lamp lit in it for 3 years, waiting for the night you would finally climb aboard. Then teach us, said a woman near the stove, her voice shaking. When the thaw comes, teach us how you did it, so no child of ours ever smothers under a low roof again. And a murmur went round the crowded room, men who had jeered 3 years running now leaning in to hear the answer. I will teach anyone who will hold a level and listen, Elias said. That is all I ever wanted. Someone to listen. No one laughed. No one had it in them to laugh ever again at Elias Renner. Amos Croft, the richest and the loudest and the proudest man in the Upper Valley, put his face in his hands and wept among the man's saved children, and the only sound in that warm room 10 feet above the buried dead was the low breath of the stove and the wind settling at last outside the double walls that had held it out. They came down off the bench in the thaw, all of them alive that Elias had reached in time, and they buried the ones the snow had taken. And then the valley did a thing it had never done for the strange, quiet man. It did not laugh. It listened. That spring, up and down the upper valley, men who had mocked the 4 tall cedar posts sank posts of their own and raised their sills up into the clear air and built their new houses high on legs of timber in the mad builder's own fashion, so the snow could find nothing flat to gather against and the cold could not press down through any low roof again. By the second summer there was not a low cabin left in the upper valley. From the peaks it must have looked strange, a whole settlement risen clear of the ground on timber legs. But no burying snow ever killed another family in that valley. Not that generation, nor the next, because a man they had called a fool had looked up when everyone else looked down, and had built to a promise instead of to his own comfort, and had kept a lamp lit for people who had not yet earned it. They stopped calling it the roost. They called it the ark, and they said it in the tone you use for a thing you are ashamed you ever mocked, and they kept Elias Renner's real name alive long after he was gone, and told their grandchildren about the winter the valley would have died in its sleep if the strangest, quietest, most laughed-at man among them had not spent 3 lonely years building them a warm room in the sky, and never once told them it was theirs. As for Elias, he lived out his days on the bench in the warm room he had built, and the valley that had shut him out now could not do enough for him, and he let them, gently, because a promise kept is a lonely thing until the day it is answered. He kept his little book to the end, and he kept his wife's Bible beside it, and every winter, on the first hard snow, he trimmed the lantern and set it burning in that small high opening that faced down the valley, though there was no longer anyone who needed to find it. When they asked him why he still lit it, he said only that a light in a window is a promise you make to a stranger you have not met yet, and that you never quite know the night one of them will be crawling up the grade in the dark, looking for a reason to keep going. And here, maybe, is the part most of us miss. The whole valley had looked at 40 acres of frozen bench and a half-fallen soddy and called it worthless, worth $2, worth nothing at all. And they had looked at the man on it and called him worthless too, a fool talking to a notebook. But the worthless ground held the only floor that stood above the killing snow, and the worthless man held the only promise strong enough to build it. And in the end, the thing the whole world had written off was the one thing that kept an entire valley alive. That is how it so often goes. The quiet ones who build to a promise, who look up when everyone else looks down, who keep a light burning for people who laugh at them, they are so easy to write off as fools, right up until the night their foolishness turns out to be the only warm room left standing. So if there is a light you have been meaning to leave burning for somebody, some quiet good thing you have been building that no one around you understands, do not wait for them to stop laughing before you finish it. Build it high. Lay it in deep. Keep the lamp trimmed. Because you never do know which cold night some frightened soul is going to come crawling up the grade in the dark, looking for the one window that means somebody, somewhere, thought of them before they ever knew they needed thinking of. Light it anyway, and thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of this one. If the story of the mad builder and the lamp in the window meant something to you, leave a word below and tell us where you are watching from, and we will keep a light on for you here too.